Hi, everybody. It's Alex Jarett with Technology Executives Club, and I'm really happy to introduce you to my good friend, Alan Darrah. Hi, Alan.
Hey, Alex. Great to be here. Glad to
Great to
talk to
have
you.
great to have you here. Alan is the CIO of Spencer Fane,
That's right.
and you are actually in Kansas City, Missouri.
Yes.
And it's steak, right? That's what you guys are known for in Kansas City, Missouri. What is it?
Thank you. But yeah, most people would probably say barbecue.
Barbecue. That's what I thought. Now I've been to Missouri. Of course, I grew up in St. Louis, and I've been to Texas, and I've been to Tennessee. What is the barbecue like in Kansas City, Missouri? Like, what's it known for?
It's the Mecca. It's where everything comes to be perfected, which is going to be to the chagrin of folks in the Carolinas and Texas for sure. But yeah, I
Yeah.
think if you want to get it all, you can come here. You can get
Okay.
great, you can get
I,
great brisket,
I,
great pork for sure.
that's wonderful. Our next summit is going to have to
Yeah.
be there in
Deal.
Kansas City, Missouri.
Deal.
So, anyways, all kidding aside, we really appreciate you being involved with the board of advisors. You're the CIO of Spencer Fane, a great firm. How many off? You guys have grown a lot in the last decade,
Opened
right?
our 27th office this week. When I
Wow.
started 9+ years ago, we were, I think, 5 or 6 offices. So we've grown quite a bit since I got here, for sure.
And you've got, wow, that's great. And I know that some of your practice areas are what are like your main practice areas? I remember talking to one of your partners, and he was a legal cybersecurity expert.
Yes, that's
Help a
right.
lot of, yeah.
One of our busiest practice groups is what you're talking about. Absolutely, our cybersecurity and breach response team,
Hmm.
and they, for uh, in good for us, bad for others. I mean, they're one of the busiest groups that we run. They
Uh-huh.
help folks, companies of all sizes, Fortune 50 companies down to startups, survive major cyber attacks and how
Wow.
ramifications of that from a legal perspective, a technology perspective. We can help kind of concierge them through the whole process. So that's actually been a great thing that I've been able to help with, and really proud of the work that my team does on the
Uh-huh.
technology side of the house, kind of behind the scenes, helping them. So that's definitely a practice group. We have major practice groups across all of kind of corporate America, right? So we have labor and employment attorneys, we have healthcare attorneys,
Got you. So you're
groups.
corporate.
But yeah, definitely. Used to be known as corporate defense, but it's not just that. We
Yeah.
really can help startups. We help found companies. We help with incubation of companies, and we deal with VCs and M&A and you name it. We've actually been doing some work with Department of Defense contractors, big
Oh,
insurance companies. We are full power now at this point.
that's awesome. Congratulations on all that. And what's really interesting when I look at your background, for those of you who haven't seen his profile, you can, if you're watching this on our side, you can click through to his LinkedIn profile. If you're on the podcast or YouTube, it's technologyexecutivesclub.com. Board of advisors, look for Alan, and there's a link to his LinkedIn profile, or you could just look him up, Alan Darrah. Might be easier. But anyways, I look at your background, man. You've had a really interesting career. I'm not going to. We'll come back to these and actually talk about them. But you had again, we'll talk about. Let me just say them real quick. Bachelor, you went to philosophy pre-law, and then you went into Bachelor of Science of Business, and then Columbia University, got a Master's of Science and MS Technology. But then, in terms of your career, you originally were an owner of a technical consulting firm, and then you went in and worked at. This is where you went to Physicians Reference Laboratory, and then you went into the faculty of Columbia University recently, and then of course at Spencer Fane. So you've had, it's not like I see some people that have like 15 different jobs. You've had like a few really good jobs that you stayed in for a while and did well in. That's what I see. Is that
It's a
about
good.
accurate?
Yeah, I mean, and absolutely, we'll talk about this as maybe we talk about the arc and kind of the interesting
Yeah.
circle. But I'm picky, and I find something that I like, and I tend to stick with it. I really enjoy the work that goes into building things, and I think that
That's
can take.
interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah. So that's very interesting because as you and I have talked, um, I know that one of your things is you're continuing to evolve your role. And when I remember when we first started talking, you were um, the director of IT,
right.
and getting the role of CIO at a major law firm. That's actually quite a big deal. People that don't know the legal environment don't really know. If you like Game of Thrones and you like working in the only thing missing is the dragon because everything else is the feudal system. And right?
It's a very interesting environment.
Yeah.
For everyone, but there is something that you can really come to enjoy if you're able to thrive here. You can thrive
Yeah.
anywhere, and it is definitely a very dynamic environment. You talk about matrix organizations and
Yeah.
the capability to get things done. Once you learn how to get things done in a law firm, you can be very effective within the law firm, or you can carry that along with you for the rest of your career.
Well, absolutely, because you're negotiating, you're getting stuff done. Yeah, that's really what it is. So let's go back. Let's talk about your background. I know you gave me a couple different notes, areas you wanted to make sure we spoke about. So don't let me miss those as we go. So what I want to do, typically what we do is we go through the background, and then you can do lessons learned along the way, or if we miss one, we summarize it, and then we go into areas you like to help people with and what you're thinking for your future as well. So, what's interesting to me is we start from the back again. I'm just looking at your profile here on LinkedIn, and I will start there. And we're I like to start in the foundation because I do see that, where people start many times, it's kind of interesting how it goes around a circle. And you fit this perfectly. You were in pre-law.
Yeah,
you went to the university, right? So you're from Missouri? Because I see.
Grew up here. Yeah, I grew up
Yeah.
in Kansas City. My mom grew up on a farm in about 45, 50 minutes south of Kansas City, and so I'm kind of from semi-rural, then suburban. The area of Western Missouri. That's where most of my family is still here, and there's something really to this place. And I've had opportunities, and I've gone to school in other places and lived other places as well. But this has always been home base for sure. And and in middle school and high school, I was a really shy kid until I got involved with theater and debate. And debate, I think, is probably one of those things that really was foundational to me. Yeah, and really learned to find my voice and learned how to communicate with others. And of course, and you can imagine how this has affected my career is being able to put logical sequence to thought, is such a foundational skill that I think has been really important to me. And then being able to communicate that, of course, is critical for all of us, no matter what we do for a living. So, you can imagine that in middle school and high school really started to set the stage for some of the things that you'll see in my profile, like, pre-law, philosophy. And philosophy, I think, a bit of a misnomer. A lot of people think about philosophy and they think about, existentialism and things like that. And those are all very fascinating.
It's really logic, isn't it?
It really is kind of
critical thinking. Yeah.
Call it proto math, right?
Yeah.
It's all logical and sequencing. It's if-thens.
Yeah.
And that's what I really loved about it. It's strangely enough, I never really enjoyed numerical math, but verbal math is I've always been attracted.
That's interesting. That's it. So, I know, I just know from reading about it, it really is, it ties in well. So it made sense that you would go into pre-law, but you made a switch though. You then ended up getting a Bachelor of Science. You started off in pre-law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, but then you moved over to Western Governor State. I don't know where that is.
Years
but
later,
then you got a BS in IT management. Was that later?
That was later. That was after what was turning into kind of a rich career and something that I really enjoyed. So I was putting away myself through undergrad, and the way that doing that was I was going around to a lot of local businesses and marketing myself as, this was the late 90s, early 2000s, when it was maybe easier to tell somebody that you were a tech expert, even when you were, for me at that age, I was a child, right? I mean, I'm 19, 20 years old, and
I wish I was a child again.
And, going around to small and medium-sized businesses in the Kansas City area and then kind of expanding upon that. And oftentimes I would, go in and effectively pitch that I could do what they needed to do to get either this office set up, and I'd run low voltage in the ceiling, and I'd set up the printers and set up their machines and set up their computers and get them, install antivirus and teach them about cybersecurity before cybersecurity was really even a thing. And that would start at, 5 o'clock on a Friday when they closed for the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
And Monday morning at about 7 o'clock, I'd be done, after having been up for many hours straight. And then I'd go to school, right? And so that's how I spent years of my life. And what was interesting, I kind of fell in love with it. I really enjoyed building things, and it was really fun for me. And so, obviously, as an undergrad and getting ready for, I was in the pre-law program with the University of Missouri system, and that's what I thought I was going to do. All of my friends went to law school, and most of them are now lawyers, practicing lawyers. So that was still part of my life too. But I had a very good conversation with a pre-law advisor, counselor, and her job was to make sure that students who were going to go into the law school really wanted to go to law school and really wanted to be attorneys, right? And really wanted to practice law or use a JD for things that you can use a JD for. And I'm not going to say she talked me out of it, but she told me about kind of the potential for the other path I was on, right? And around that same time, I also was building a good relationship with one of my big clients, which became where I ended up working for about 10 years, which was the laboratory system. And they were affiliated with a big hospital group in the Midwest. And weird way to get there, but yeah.
So what was the big lesson learned for that? I mean, I see a couple things, that you could share for other people maybe going through their journey.
Yeah.
Because I see a couple things that happened there. You were on your path. You thought you were going to be a lawyer, but then you were doing this thing on the side, and the side thing became the thing.
Yeah. Yeah. What was interesting is probably pretty important for me at the time. I was also learning about different religions, and one of them is Taoism or Taoism and Buddhism, right? And how the path is what is the path, right? So the path can change, and you are on the path. You can't necessarily always change the path, but you can navigate how you navigate the path is kind of one way to look at a lot of that philosophy. And it really was speaking to me at the time. And I think the way that she pitched it to me was, here's another way to get where you can leverage parts of your brain that I think you might enjoy more than actually, the work of becoming a working lawyer is oftentimes this path, and you're going to go work for a law firm, and you're going to sit and you're going to read and you're going to write for 10 hours a day. What you're doing, I think you're really enjoying, and maybe that's more fulfilling to you. And I was, making good money at the time, and really kind of building relationships that I felt were really, kind of interesting, and learning how businesses worked, and meeting senior vice presidents and presidents and CEOs of companies, and starting to become very fascinated by how the business world works. And so I think the lesson there is, realizing that there's a lot of different ways to accomplish what you want to be when you grow up, and never locking yourself into anything. I think it was Oscar Wilde that said that, the one of the traps in life is that if you think that you'll become something, you will, right? And that I think is can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. So I think some people think they're on a path and they lock themselves into it, and they march as hard as they can to get to what they think is the mountain, not realizing that it's actually a mountain range.
Wow. I feel like I'm talking to a philosophy major. Oh my God, you actually are. It's pretty. Namaste. So then you went to physicians. It sounds like one of your big, real jobs that you got a lot of people have what I call foundational jobs. You were an entrepreneur, you got a taste of tech, you liked it, you were making money, and then you moved into that with your new degree as you were doing that. And then now all of a sudden, you're help desk now you're working for a big company, I imagine. You're a help desk internal security auditor, and then all of a sudden you actually are the IT manager and security officer. So you kind of jumped to a big spot.
I started to kind of climb a ladder, right? I never really, I mean, we all know about the kind of the concept of a corporate ladder.
Yeah.
But then effectively at what was for them entry level, after I had kind of established a relationship with them, and with the idea that eventually I'd help them lead the department as they were trying to design and build it, but they didn't know how. And so this was effectively a small reference laboratory. If anybody's not familiar with how a reference laboratory works, is when you go to your doctor and you get blood drawn, it's usually going to go to a reference laboratory. There's only really these days, there's only a couple big ones in the country. There are probably still many smaller ones. This was one of the smaller ones that, fast forward about a decade and it got acquired, which is how another kind of pivot point for me. But they were also affiliated, like I mentioned, with a large hospital group based in the Kansas City area, but they had hospitals and hundreds of clinics across the Midwest. And so learning about how the different scale of IT was really, really interesting. And that was really key. That maybe is one of the foundational things that I learned in that role is doing IT for a company with hundreds or even thousands of employees at 1 minute of the day, and then effectively trying to do different types of IT, which is where my specialty was, because I did a lot of work in my own, when I was running my own shop for a lot of very small for clinical practices where maybe it's just one doctor, a couple of nurses, and a phlebotomist. Right. And so I was able to kind of weave my way into a lot of those environments very naturally, using some of again, you go back to the communication skills that I've been developing for a really long time. Again, at this point, I've kind of backed my way into becoming a technologist, but it wasn't necessarily ever anything that I focused on. I did not have visions of becoming a network expert or a switching expert.
But you did get the background. I mean, you went out and got a Bachelor of Science in Information Technology Management, and you were actually working. So I think you might be kidding yourself. You did get the training. You did get the background to become a technologist, but it wasn't initially.
Yeah, it was never intentional, but I realized
you just liked it.
What gap do I have so that I can excel at this thing that I'm interested in, right?
Yeah.
And so that's when you start looking at
that's an interesting lesson
and things like that. Absolutely.
That's a really good lesson. So, as you were on your rise in your career, because when I look at your career from this vantage point, it does look thought out. You're saying it wasn't. You're saying it was serendipitous.
It's interesting. Yeah. I mean,
it looks thought out because
Alex, we could talk philosophy here for a few minutes if you're not careful, right? Because, what is fate, right? And absolutely. Yeah, it is. I think it's fair to say that it was well thought out, but with a very short horizon, right?
Yeah.
And thinking about what do I need to do now to do this thing that I'm very interested in, and I feel like I'm thriving at, but I could do better. That too is planning, right? It's just shorter than many people think.
That's great. So one of the notes that you gave to me as you were thinking about this, which I think we covered, from philosophy major to technology leader. I like that. I think we covered that. But then the other one is from the help desk to the boardroom. So let's cover that now, because you jumped from that role to two things. And I don't know which came first, really. You went to Fane, sorry. As you came in as the IT director. So that's a good jump. You went from manager at this bigger company I manage, and now you're the IT director. And I remember one of you were on the way we got to know each other is you were on a couple keynote panels. And I remember that you really liked solving problems that made business sense, and you told me about the fact that one of the biggest problems that they had at the time was onboarding. And so you were very used to solving problems for the business, which I imagine is why you eventually moved into the CIO role.
I think so. Yeah, Alex, effectively it's, and I think as we build our careers, those of us who love solving problems, which is a lot of us in technology and engineering and other fields, ultimately we're going to continue to be satisfied with what we do if we can also scale our career with the scale of the problems that we're able to help people with.
Yes.
And I think that's effectively, if that is all you're able to do in your career, then you've done it. I really believe that. And so,
I agree with you. Yeah. You're solving problems for other people and you'll get paid for it.
And I think, some folks, maybe they decry it, maybe it's talked about in certain circles, and I've had some interesting conversations with colleagues and maybe people who, my wife is actually, she's working on her MPA right now, so she works in the public sector and for nonprofits, right? And so we sometimes have almost philosophical discussions about the
Don't
role
get
of,
me started.
and yeah, it's very interesting. Growing up in my, living in my house, we talk about organizational development over the dinner table, right? So, kind of an interesting subsect of power couples, I suppose. But,
I'll
thinking
just say it this way. That's your pre-talk. I won't use the phrase, any other phrase, but that's your pre-talk for your Saturday night.
These are the things we're interested in.
Yeah, you better watch out if you get into politics. That might spoil the whole evening.
And I've also had very interesting philosophical discussions with one of my fellow professors, one of my fellow instructors at Columbia.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that too. Yeah.
What she taught at law school was effectively, if you kind of peel the onion a little bit, what she was really teaching her students about was the role of a corporation in society, right? And so I've had the great fortune of having some very intense and deep conversations with her that really taught me a different perspective on what businesses are for. And so there's also kind of that little subset of thought process going on in my head too. But what was, that day was actually maybe kind of interesting in terms of, again, a pivot point or fate or all these things combined was the day that we found out at our little clinical reference laboratory that we were going to be acquired by, I think, the number one or number two reference laboratory in the world, 60,000, 70,000 employees, a massive Fortune 50 company, if I understand correctly, and for sure, Fortune 100. As I was walking back to my desk, my cell phone rings and it's a recruiter saying, "Hey, I happen to have your resume cross my desk. I saw that you were pre-law and you were headed to law school. Would you ever be interested in a role leading the technology function for a large law firm?" Right?
Oh.
And so that was,
that's how you got the opportunity?
These kind of interesting serendipitous things that happen. And some days they happen just at the right moment.
Wait, was this at Columbia?
No, this was in 2015, and effectively it was the job at Spencer Fane.
Okay.
Yeah, so I, at the time, like you see, I was an IT manager and I had been doing a lot of internal audit work.
Yeah.
Effectively what would become cyber audit work. We didn't call it that at the time.
Uh-huh.
For the laboratory and for the healthcare system. And so I kind of had that background. And so when I came and started talking about that skill set with the law firm where I still am today, and talking with them about how I thought that there was a good translation for being able to bring in some of that skill set to a law firm that, we talked in my initial conversations with the law firm about how they knew they were about to grow exponentially and they needed to bring in a professional IT leader to help. That
could help them do that.
Build a structure that was more process driven, right? More standard, and that was what I thought that I could bring to the table, and they agreed. Thank goodness, because it's worked out pretty well. So this was back in 2015. As came in as IT director, really enjoyed the thought of being able to come in and effectively what I was saying at the time was I felt like I was the captain of my own ship, right? So you get your orders from the Admiralty, but you're out to sea, and because they didn't know how to run a technology function, they were effectively a partnership of lawyers. They let me to my own devices, and I was able to create and innovate and be a very visionary leader for them, and that was a blast. It has
been. But the thing that you do well, one of the common elements, you have a lot of common elements with some of the other leaders in the board of advisory community, and all of them are very successful. And one of them is advanced schooling. I see that a lot. The other is solving problems for other people. You've mentioned that. I just finished an interview with somebody else, and he talked about one of his career traits was looking for companies that had big problems.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And he could come in but it sounds like you had the opportunity to solve. They knew they were going to grow, so you could create processes to allow them to have the infrastructure keep up, if not excel or accommodate, or actually help make it easier to grow, through acquisition and mergers. So that's what you've done. And along the way, you learned cybersecurity, obviously. But I want to talk about you also teach at
Yeah.
Columbia. And I know
Yeah.
that was really important. I remember when that happened, I was so happy. I mean, I remember you saw your note on LinkedIn. It's like, hey, are you considered you are associate professor or associate faculty?
Right. Yeah. Associate instructor. I'm a member of faculty there.
That's
It's
so great.
really a great honor in my life. So the relationship there was built first as a student, right? So
Uh,
in 2017, I finished my second undergrad, right? So this is when I
oh,
went to school and finished my Bachelor of Science in business with a focus in technology management. Because again, I identified that if I want to build my career and the problems that I can help solve to the next level, I realized that I wanted to go back and kind of formalize my education because I've always, formal education, you probably have picked up on this. And in fact, Alex, you and I have talked about this. I truly and deeply believe in formal education.
yeah.
I always enjoy being a student, even in elementary school, middle school, high school. And even looking back, I mean, it really, some of my greatest moments of joy are recognitions that, back then all you had to do was learn, right? I mean, as adults, thinking back to, I wish, some of us maybe would have enjoyed that more, but I realized that I did. I really did
You
enjoy it.
enjoyed it. I could tell. I was
Absolutely.
always the guy in the back of the class making fun of people, even the teacher. Sorry, if you I don't think she's listening to this, but oh God, when I was in
Noted.
high school. Let's go back to, something I want to get into some because we've got your story. It's pretty straightforward, really. You know, it, it was serendipitous. You started off in pre-law. What's really interesting is you ended up in law
Yeah.
for now. You're
It-
you're not you're not practicing law, but you're
that's right.
serving lawyers who are practicing law. So in effect, you are by taking this approach, one could argue that you're helping people through law more than if you were just an individual lawyer. Unless
Very
you were on Amazon, you were Goliath. If you read that show, watch
well.
that show, and you're like made 50 billion off of one case, but but or whatever it was. But you actually are helping a lot of people through law through what you're doing now, which is it is a big circle. It is so zen.
Learning
Like,
how a law firm that helps businesses,
uh,
open the doors, run themselves safely,
yeah,
uh, and then survive, what could be a traumatic or even killer event for
yeah,
that company, um, has been so fascinating. Being able to see behind the scenes of how the both the economy works, how the labor market works, how these organizations work, and we represent, small governments, mid-sized governments as well. We also represent non-for-profits, and so you can see behind the scenes for everything that you learn in business school. And then I found fascinating and still I still pull out almost like their desk reference books, some of my textbooks, right? Like I still, use those things as very useful tools, but then seeing it in practice and seeing how the conversations that lawyers have and the work that they do for our companies really ties you to the community.
yeah.
Really understand your part. And that was one of the things that I found incredibly fulfilling when I worked in healthcare was
Oh,
I felt like I was close-ish to patient care and really serving my community using my skill set, right?
that's
And
interesting. You're not the first guy to tell me that. I talked to someone who interviewed someone who was in medical devices,
Mhm, mhm.
and they were able to tie what they were doing to patient care, which motivated them. And I think that's a huge lesson that you just mentioned, which if you can it's so easy the bigger the company that you get to feel lost. You're on an assembly line, you're you're in the mailroom, you're in the supply room, or you're a secretary for somebody typing letters. But if you can somehow tie yourself to the service that you're doing, that the company is doing for others,
That's
it's
right.
got to be much more fulfilling, right, Alan? That's
Yes.
what you're saying. That's your lesson. This is your lesson. I'm just
Yeah,
re
I totally agree. And
I'm putting it in simpler terms because
I think
I'm a simpler guy.
famously, I think it was JFK was touring NASA and he
Yeah.
talks with somebody on the custodial staff, and I'm going to paraphrase, but it was something. It's really a thing that rings in my brain. And he says, hey, what do you do here? And effectively a janitor. And I'm going to paraphrase, but he says, I'm doing my part to put people on the moon, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, that really, it kind of like, that can send.
Okay, like that.
Right. And any of us, effectively, we can find fulfillment. One of the talks that I had an opportunity to give this year was on building a career. You mentioned it earlier, which was titled effectively, from the help desk to the boardroom, how to build a career using communications and savvy leadership. And one of the topics that I bring up is effectively the value of toil. Right. And there's a really interesting German word for, and I'll try and think of it. It's
toil.
Well, it is effectively
struggle, hard work.
The value of doing things that are incredibly difficult and tedious for a really long time.
Yeah.
So one, you become expert at them, but two, so that you are effectively able to contribute.
Yeah.
Right. And, to me, that means a lot of whether it be formal education, actual, training, going to technical training, keeping up to date on a lot of the things that are coming out in terms of, when I was younger in my career, network switching and a lot of the equipment that was coming out, and then learning about cloud in the early 2010s and learning about some of the things that are happening right now, of course, with AI and the accelerating change of how businesses are going to run themselves with a lot of new technology. Well, that's all for a purpose. It's because these are the skill sets that I build in myself so that I can serve people around me and help the community solve its problems.
Well, I think part of what I'm hearing, which just goes back to your original comments about philosophy, is be okay with your path. Just keep going through your path.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've heard it said another way. Sometimes you talk about, it's funny, the fellow I just interviewed, just edited his recording, said a lot, completely different backgrounds as you, said a lot of the same things, that the hard work is what defines leaders. That's how he said it.
Yeah. And
you're saying the same thing, is that the people who learned how to get through the hard work, look, work is called work for a reason. If you're lucky and you can become an actor and live the dream, God bless you. We'll watch you on the Academy Awards and wish we were hanging out with you for like 5 minutes. But, right? I mean, that's what they're selling. Yeah. But these people, believe me, these people have issues too. We all have issues. That's the human condition. But back into the work life, it's called work for a reason, because you're doing things to help that are complicated. They could be hard. Even, you go back to that janitor. He shows up. He keeps his equipment clean. He takes the grief that people look down on him, even though there's no reason to. He's another person.
Yeah.
And he keeps those floors clean and everything else, because it's important to work in a really clean environment. Or you look at the help desk guy. People could act like that to them. You got the executive who yells at him or whatever. I want this thing done. And he just knows how to handle him. Figures out how to handle that. That's a big deal.
Yeah, I think one of the first things, well, kind of a sub thought there that reaction to that thought process is I remember it was paragraph 1, day 1 of one of my first business classes, was learning about a concept called the internal locus of control, right? And how much of our lives and our businesses and everything around us is actually controlled internal to us, right? And it's not just your take on things, but your ownership of what happens to you and happens to others around you is up to you, right? I mean, there's so many different ways to say that, but I remember that was very telling that was in the first paragraph of the first chapter of the first book that I read in a business class.
That's really interesting.
Also very seminal too.
Now, since you are a lawyer, I am going to ask you to produce that page to back up your story.
I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah, you only play one on TV. Since you do work for lawyers, I am going to ask you to
That's right.
to prove that. It's not what you say; it's what you can prove.
pretty sure that's still on my bookshelf in my office at home. So yeah, I
Yeah, I
probably.
expect a photocopy of that.
Um,
I'm just teasing.
but the other side of that is, I also think, when we talk about, for example, the
Uh,
the janitor at NASA, there was probably also someone who he worked with or for,
hmm.
who taught him the vision, right? Because I think a lot of
Oh,
folks.
right. It didn't like he just picked it up. The culture taught him.
That's right. And I think that there's organizations that have that good culture, and I'm thankful to work at one
Amazon, you work in one. You work in
where,
one now.
yeah, the conversations that I get to have with our chairperson and with our partnership and with the other shared services leaders and then with my team are all based on kind of marching in the same direction, trying to
Hmm.
do the thing just in our way. And my hope, that I'm able to share my interpretation of that vision with my team, and that they then take that and move forward with what they do. And
Hmm.
I've heard good feedback from a lot of folks in my department, even, who say, we also do a survey, for example, every January, just checking in with my own team. How are you feeling? How are you feeling about what you're doing?
Hmm.
Understand what the mission is. Do you feel like you're connected to the team? Do you feel like you're connected to the work? And most of the feedback that we get is pretty positive, that people do feel like they're actually part of a group, they're part of a mission. And so I think we as leaders, that's probably the most important thing we do. I think there's,
That's interesting.
talking about some of the key things that great leaders are good at.
Hmm.
Sharing that vision is definitely one of them. I think it's one of the most critical foundations of good executive presence, which is what they'd call in kind of, leadership academia. Um, and it is a critical skill that, I think is maybe also, it's not that it's even undervalued or anything like that. It's just quiet.
Hmm.
And so I think there are a lot of really great leaders at a lot of organizations who are not on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, and they're not the 50 under 50 and things like that all the time. They're just doing the work. I really believe that there are a lot of great leaders out there at organizations.
I interviewed somebody else once, and I have this one guy who speaks for us occasionally. You know who he is. I won't say his name, but he always talks about the alpha.
Mm,
You want to be the alpha.
mm,
And then, because that's where the big returns are in companies. If you can become the alpha in a market, that's what it means.
yeah,
And I don't, for those of you who don't know what it means in math, it means you make the most money, have the
yeah,
biggest share, you make the most. I'm not talking about somebody who's bossing everybody around. That's not what I'm talking about. It's not your dog you're talking about. It's the person who has the highest return on investment or the company. So anyways, I was talking to somebody else about this, and somebody you've seen speaks to a lot of our events. He's quite smart. And I was trying to sound smart. I'm like, back to high school. So, and I was like, yeah, you want to be the alpha? He goes, you know what? Everybody has this concept, you got to be number one. You actually don't. If you
mm,
look at the Fortune 1000, most of them are doing quite well. And you could have a mid-sized company that you're making a lot of money. You don't have to always be the alpha to do extremely well in life. And I'm like, well, that's a good concept. So anyways, so let's go through. You gave me some excellent notes about some career evolution, major pivot points, lessons learned, and then areas that you want to help people in. So what I want to do is just make sure we go through some of that. I think you've covered at least 65, 75%, but there's a couple of them here that are pretty cool that I want to make sure people hear. First of all, you went from philosophy. We talked about this. You went from philosophy major to technology leader. And I think the thing there was two things that I heard was you were number one, you learned to just kind of go with the flow, and then you found what you really liked doing. And the interesting circle is then you ended up in law anyways, at least for now, and but not as a lawyer. So I think that was pretty cool. From help desk to boardroom, you haven't really talked about your aspiration for boardroom, but I know in your notes that part of what you're doing is planning to go to the next level. You had a really interesting statement here in the notes that you gave me was you are a technologist, but the technology is evolving so much. It really much is more about being a leader, understanding people and understanding business process
mm.
and using the technology. You don't have to be yourself a technologist as deeply as you used to be to get things done with technology. Am I right about that? That's what you're saying.
Totally agree. And
Yeah.
the thought process there is what really contributes at the highest levels of an organization is what I call predictability. And predictability was the finance was the language of predictability and still is. Now technology is the language of predictability. And so with SOX in the early 2000s and the expansion of the importance of having corporate financial expert board, that is still essential. And now the new essential is having technology expertise on the board, right? And yeah, that's definitely something that I'm building in my own skill set, a gap that I've identified that I want to build and develop for myself so that I can become that voice in the room on how to help steer an organization from a director level when it comes to technology, cyber risk, and technology risk. Absolutely.
You know, when I was my first, I sold in my dad's company, but the first job I got as a professional salesperson was selling for a legal software company. And one of my clients was the CIO of Winston and Strong, and he became the COO. So I want you to know the path is absolutely there. We see a lot of people become the CIO. I see a lot of people. It just makes sense that someone that's running technology, you're basically automating or augmenting business processes.
Right.
And with the case of AI, we're not going to really delve too deep into AI today, although we could get philosophical about it. That's over a beer. It is Friday that we're recording this. So, that could be a game changer for a lot of business processes. So we'll find out. But I think that's a good note, what you just said. So that answers your question of how you think about your career. And I think the fact that you even did it this way, not everybody gives me these kinds of notes. I think that's a lesson in itself. You think in terms of these paths, philosophy major to technology leader, from help desk to boardroom, aiming for C-suite and eventually board roles. You've got your teaching background, you've got your experience. I think it's wonderful that you think like that. But let's talk about, I want to do what I call the quick round because we've been talking for a while. Significant projects and storylines. So I'm going to list the three. You don't have to do all of them unless you want to, but AI ethics and systematic thinking, systematic technology risk, you name that one. Advocacy for cyber experts on boards and leadership and digital transformation. These are sort of things that you did. So, those are the three things, and I think they may all kind of tie together. So if you could kind of quickly, tighten a bow in terms of lessons learned, your experience and lessons learned. So for the viewers, they can see, this is how it all ties together and how you did it real quick. So tell us sort of the story. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the best technology leaders right now are combining these
I agree.
domains, right? There's a lot of overlap. And so when you think about enterprise architecture and kind of the subset of technology architecture, if you're doing that with very good basics, well, what are the basics? It's governance, risk, and compliance, right? And so and then it becomes a virtuous circle, so that you're effectively tying your digital platforms that you're building as your organization is becoming digital disruption, call it whatever you want, whether it's adoption of AI or the expansion of AI, machine learning and deep learning. Those are all things that are accomplished best when you're really good at the basics. And so I think that's what a lot of folks are maybe skipping or not thinking as much about right now is how we can contribute to our organizations kind of this phase of their growth cycles is going back to basics actually and thinking about governance, risk and compliance, thinking about kind of being the masters of our data and making sure that it's doing the right things in the right places. And that is actually what I think is being seen as both the safest, maybe not the sexiest, but the safest way to actually make good investments, whether they be in AI or something related to AI. As folks have been talking about digital disruption for about 10 years now. Most people don't know how to do it. In my experience, most even senior technology leaders have really been struggling to identify what it is. And what's interesting is that it is a reinvigoration of the basics.
Oh,
and, yeah, I really believe that.
I like that phrase. So, I was on another interview the other day and, a lot of people do continuous improvement. And the comment that came up, and not in the interview, but in the keynote panel, was AI. You can start with that, but those are the table stakes. AI, it is not an AI talk. ain't going to be continuous improvement for the people who really win. It's going to be, like you said, what'd you say, reevaluation of the basics?
A
Like how
reevaluation of the basics. Yeah.
reinvent. So how are you going to get the business process done better, faster, more efficiently? Because it is all about getting it done and better ROI. And so I think you're on to something there. So, I think what I just heard also, and there are a lot of people that I interview, and I think you got the same sort of mix. It's you can't just be the IT person anymore. You're really the business person that's using IT to support the business and to enhance and grow the business.
Yeah, it's a
And
weird.
cybersecurity, you can't get away from it. And you have to understand cybersecurity. It's such a big risk that you just have to understand it. So I think you got your three-legged stool there. You mentioned AI ethics, systemic technology risk, advocacy for cybersecurity. So you're talking about similar things, but really not a little, and then leadership and digital transformation. So
Yeah.
did you want to add something?
Well, what you evoked in my head was this thought, which I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is the weird cycle of technology leaders and how they've come into the role. So back in the 90s and even into the 2000s, oftentimes the person who was taking over as CIO or CTO or something like that was coming from some other expertise, whether it be operations or finance or something like that. And they were having to learn tech, right? Well, fast forward just 15 or so years, and you've got tech leaders who are now trying to figure out how to run a business, right? That's been my experience. Is I've had the opportunity to have lots of students and lots of classmates over the last 5 or 7 years, is they're kind of headed in one direction or the other, which is so fascinating. But the top technology leaders are really, it's so natural for them that they understand that technology and business are effectively have become the same thing. I don't know what year that happened, and it was kind of a slow metamorphosis over time, maybe an evolution, if you will, with revolutions here and there. But technology business leader is now one thing. And so I think that's maybe kind of fits with my unique path that I was able to get here, was starting out not necessarily as a technologist, didn't know I was on that path until I realized it was the path.
Interesting. It's good. Okay, let's start to wrap this up. What I want to do is lessons learned, and then yeah, big lessons learned, and then areas I like to help people with. Is that all right? We'll do those. So the big lesson learned was philosophy meets technology. You just kind of said it. But if there's something you want to add on that, building a tech career, I think you talked about well, you said it in the beginning on philosophy meets technology. That was the beginning of our conversation. Building a tech career. This is one that I'm not sure you cover. Effective communication, strategic leadership are key lessons. You're kind of hinting at it now, but this is how you wrote it before. Building a tech career, effective communication, strategic leadership are key lessons.
Yeah, I think no matter what our domain of expertise is, the better we can be as leaders first, right?
Yeah.
I think that's and learning about how to become a good executive is a real skill. Just like a lot of us need to go get our certifications in networking or cybersecurity. There are so many great resources out there to become to build your muscle effectively as a leader. And I would even say a subset of that is as an executive leader. That too is a distinct skill.
I think you're right.
And learning about how to create and share a vision. That's an executive skill, in my opinion, right? How to make sense of things. In fact, that is one of the number one skills identified just within the last 2 years. So it wasn't even on most academic leadership.
That's really interesting.
Leadership programs, was this concept that I heard is called sense making. Sense making is now the critical skill for an executive leader, because of the acceleration of the dynamism of our lives.
Yeah.
And being able
That's really interesting.
Of what's happening is probably the critical skill for any leader right now. And it's going to set you apart as an executive.
That's a great tip. Simon Sinek talks about the why. It's kind of an extension of that. what is our mission? What is our vision? What's our culture? Why are we doing this? I'm going to tell you candidly, for me, it took a long time to figure this one out. You know, I had the sense of doing events for CIOs, people like you, and I would say that our mission now is empowering and promoting
Mhm.
technology executives and technology industry executives in the age of AI and influence. And so for a long time, I was just doing half of that, just empowering through content and through community. And now we added the promoting part, which ties into something that you mentioned to me before about how important the executive brand is for any kind of leader nowadays. You mentioned that to me before. I believe that, obviously. You're speaking to the choir on that one, you know. And I think that I think it's interesting. And I think Simon Sinek, I think what you're saying is kind of a tangent of what he's been saying. So if you are a good leader, you've got to figure out how did you say it? You got to figure out how to explain what we're doing so they
Uh,
have that vision.
yeah, effectively, yeah. It's a combination of skills. One of them is sense making, and then another is sharing the vision, right? So
Sharing the vision. Okay. Yeah.
sense making effectively is helping folks understand what's happening right now because it's become so fast that we're in the unique position often as technology leaders to truly understand what is happening right now. We can have those conversations about AI. We can have those conversations about, deep learning and quantum mechanics or quantum computing, I should say, right? So we understand enough of it to speak to it intelligently, and then we can help others understand that. We are often at times the translators for sure. So yeah, and then kind of connected to that is building what I call a leadership ecosystem, and having good
Well, I like
relationships
that.
with leaders,
Yeah.
and then bringing people into that ecosystem who maybe are not technologists or not in technology, not in the trade like we are, so that no matter kind of industry agnostic, so that people understand because technology has become, this molten core of how the world is running now. We own that domain, right?
Hmm.
And so we can start inviting folks in, whether they be your CFO at your company, or they can be someone who's trying to start a company that doesn't understand how the technology is going to work. We can start to share with them our expertise and our knowledge so that they can do what they need to do, and then we expand that ecosystem.
That's really interesting. I do see technology not only taking over more roles in the company, but in society as well.
Hmm.
And we could really go off on a tangent with that one, but we're not going to today. I read a really interesting article that somebody on LinkedIn posted, and I'm going to get to your articles in a second. Um, but she posted about this. I forget what magazine it was from one of the journals,
Mm-hmm.
talking about we're going to be building, because they're building computers to be more human-like, to talk to us. We're going to be developing more relationships with these devices, and it's going to, you're a philosophy guy. Psychologists and philosophy people are saying this is going to be a big societal shift.
It's already started. Here's a very
Yeah.
quick example of it is, where does political discourse occur now? On technology platforms, right?
It's just people
So,
yelling at each other now.
well, but it doesn't, because the technologists have built the platform so that that is acceptable
You're
and
saying
normal.
that's the town hall.
And because we've built a new town hall that's on X or it's on Instagram, that's where people are getting their information about political discourse and being able to contribute to political discourse, but it's not built for that because it was built to make money, right? And so that those of us who are,
That's a really good point. This stuff is built to make money.
that's right. And so those of us who are in
Yeah.
charge of the technology, whether that you be the CEO of a tech company or the CIO of any company, that's the dialogue you need to be ready to have. And so that maybe gets into a lot of the LinkedIn conversation that I've been trying to contribute
Yeah.
on
You
the ethics of what we do for a living.
You do. I'm glad you brought that up. In fact, this is what I was getting to, which you probably could see I was moving towards. AI, you do write about AI ethics and technology risk, and I think maybe one of your mentoring segments. This is for everybody, the board of advisory interview, and then every quarter, if they want to, you all can do a session. So I think your topic is critical. We're in an interesting world, and you've had a really great career, but I don't know if you're just three-quarters of the way or halfway. I think the best is yet to come. I mean, I
Yeah,
think I think you're doing some really cool work. If you're not following Alan, please follow Alan Darrah. He's posting some really interesting posts about here. Just read some best leadership development tools. There's something about Spencer Fane. He's a good corporate citizen. That's good. I mean, because they're a great firm. Um, let's see, something about corporate strategy. There's even digital marketing audit. So, AI safety, ethics. So you have some good posts here that are very interesting. So please follow them. And is there anything you want to add before we close it off? It's been a great interview, very interesting. I think we had a lot of lessons learned.
yeah,
Anyways, I think I learned so many lessons talking to you. I hope the people listening did too. But just being a little, like you said, you become what you think about. And I like the fact that you believe in higher ed. A lot of people keep doing that. You keep getting educated along the way, and you serve what's in front of you. You have that path, but don't be afraid to maybe take that right turn as you're climbing up the mountain. Maybe you thought you were going to take the left turn, but when you get there and you see, this right side of the summit looks a little better than the left side does today, I think I'll take that turn. That's okay.
I,
That's okay.
I like the way you say that, and like I said earlier, I think it's you may be wanting to march towards a mountain, but realize it's a mountain range, and they're all interesting.
Yeah.
And I think that our the what we build, we don't know. I mean, we're always only in the moment,
Yeah.
obviously. But we can design the future. I think that the things that we set in motion, it's exciting and fun to see the different directions they can go.
Good. Well, thank you so much for doing this today. Thanks for being on the board of advisors. Remember, everybody, the board of advisors is not the board of advisors for me. Obviously, I talk to everybody and I get great advice. It's the board of advisors for you. And Alan just gave you his board of advisor interview, a lot of lessons learned in his career. And then hopefully we'll set up a mentoring segment very quickly after this gets published. And we'll start talking about some of these awesome topics. Like you can teach us about AI and ethics or anything you want, cybersecurity, whatever you want, digital transformation. We'll do it because, you've had some great lessons along your way. Let's teach some people how they can do the same. Alan, thank you for being on the board of advisors. Thanks for doing this today.
Alex, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Been a lot of fun. All right.